you have the British Medical Society. That's their equivalent of the American Medical Association. The British Medical Society coming out and telling employers they shouldn't use the word pregnant woman. You've got the Midwives Alliance of North America using the phrase birthing individual. So I'm saying if we can't even talk about the basic reproductive differences between men and women, we can't talk about anything. And again, I mean, it just plays into my thesis that women are the ones who are going to be harmed by a culture that can't even appreciate the very difficult and distinct thing that only women go through.
Tricky little beast!
Oh,
Hale.
yeah.
Hey, Truth Seekers, welcome back. I'm super excited to have my next guest on the show. She recently wrote a blockbuster bestseller. I assume it's a bestseller. I know I loved it. It's called Sex Scandal. It's right here. You should go out and get it on Amazon immediately. And if you have it and haven't read it, well, then you're crazy. It's fantastic. You can see her work in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today. Pretty much everywhere you go, you can find Ashley McGuire, and most recently on PragerU, which I'm going to ask her about. So, Ashley, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So that's a lot of places to post your work. I'm curious, where did the idea for the book come from? Kind of give us the quick intro to how this work came about and why you're so passionate about it.
Sure. Well, I've been writing about the issues that are in the book: sex, gender identity, feminism, and how this all plays out. It was actually the book's publisher that came to me and asked me if I'd be interested in writing about sort of tying it all together. How does Beyonce relate to boardroom quotas? How does that relate to, the curriculum in elementary school? So the book is my attempt to tie all of these different threads we're seeing in society together and show how it's all related.
So the book came out earlier in the year, and it's really interesting. We were just talking before we came on that since that time, you had referenced in the book that Hollywood was a breeding ground for sexual harassment and poor treatment towards women. And you mentioned some directors, not by name, but just saying there are people in Hollywood who basically their life kind of reflects what you see in the movies. It's women being used as sex objects and having that held over their heads. And now today, what do we have? A pretty predictable outcome where media and the Hollywood, anywhere men want access to women, that's what's happening. So did you know what was coming? I put my money in Bitcoin, only too late. Did you know what was going on in Hollywood? And this book came out right at the right time?
Sure. Well, I wouldn't say I knew, but I do think that, if you follow Hollywood closely, which I have since I was young, I've always been reading Us Weekly. But if you're looking at sort of how these issues play out in Hollywood, you would have known before all of this that misogyny was very endemic in Hollywood. And so when the Harvey Weinstein story broke, I remember reading it and thinking, why is everyone freaking out about this? I feel like I've already heard this before. And then I remembered, I wrote in my book all about it. I just didn't know it was Harvey Weinstein. It was just a question of who was this producer who was, sexually harassing all these women, which goes to show that if I knew about this and I was writing about it in my book, I remember thinking, well, everybody must actually know who this guy is. If I'm just gleaning this from the pages of People magazine. But no, I think what's happening is bigger than anybody would have expected. I don't think it's over. But in my book, I think I make the argument that we should have been able to see this coming.
So I kind of want to give people an overview of you see the cover and maybe you're not sure what it is. And I have to say, my wife had a beef with me because I left this on my dashboard. So people in my neighborhood, she's like, they're going to think you have some weird fetish with naked Barbie dolls. Like, oh, that's their problem. But the funny thing about it is you were on PragerU, which I want to ask you about because I thought that was really cool. And I had a guest on a few months ago who said that he doesn't like PragerU because he thinks the snippets are too short. It doesn't give people a larger overview. No surprise, he's an academic, but I'm not sure that he's wrong because as I read through the book, every single chapter has something like, holy smokes, like this is so obvious when you read it and you put together the anecdotal and the evidentiary support for it. And basically, I think your overall thesis is that everywhere that the line has been blurred in sexuality and gender, it's harmed women. Maybe with the exception of the police force, it's been bad for women. And then you talk about it, you go back to historically how we've come full circle because women for the longest time were just considered inferior versions of men. True or untrue? Is that pretty much on the mark?
Yeah, no. I mean, you want to be my publicist? You
Yes.
nailed it. Um, but no, exactly. And then I would sort of add one more piece to that, which is that I think most people, 99% of people, are of goodwill and genuinely want to see true equality between the sexes. We constantly hear about gender equality, sexual equality. And my kind of secondary argument is that the only way we will get there is if we start by understanding, and not just understanding, but accepting and celebrating what makes us different. And that, I think, you nailed the first part of it, which is that whenever we've tried to deny sexual reality, women end up getting the short end of the stick and end up getting basically tried to uh, be forced into a male model that they just can't flourish in. And that the only way we're going to see women flourish is if we create society in such a way that it understands, acknowledges, accepts, and celebrates what makes us unique, our unique contribution to society, and the way the sexes should relate to each other.
So for people wondering, okay, well, actually, let me start with PragerU because I think that must have been kind of a nice little kick. They have 5 billion views. How does one get on PragerU? Is it difficult? You didn't get sexually harassed on set, I'm assuming, but I'd like to give me the details.
No, they're real gentlemen. They have an extraordinarily. I was blown away by how state of the art their facilities are. I mean, they use sort of real Hollywood style production, and so I was very impressed by that. They reached out to me. I think one of their producers had read my book. I went on Prager's radio show first, and actually, Dennis Prager's been talking and writing about this issue for long before people were really paying attention to it. So I think it helps that this was something that he was passionate about.
Gotcha. I think that's fantastic. So I find myself talking about it just in regular life. I don't have Dennis's platform, but just the other day, and I'll just give people examples. You start off the book by talking about UFC, you go into Hollywood, you talk about politics, you talk about media, and the first time I think I really became aware of it when I was watching the Olympics 3 years ago. I might be wrong about that, but the person's name, I think he, she, Z is from South Africa, and the name is Semenaya. Do you remember watching Semenaya run the 800 in the women's Olympics? It's this person who's maybe androgynous, maybe has both parts. We don't really know. And it fostered this whole discussion of, is this person a man? Should they be racing? And I remember watching Semenaya beat the really cute blonde British girl in the 800, and not just beat her, like beat her pretty bad. And they interviewed her, and they did something that you mentioned happens in the book, where someone gets beat and they toe the PC line. They said, do you think it's fair that this person who might be a man is, racing at you? And she's in tears, and her whole life dream has been crushed because she watched this half guy beat her by 15 yards in the race. She's like, well, it's up for them to decide. I don't really understand it. Yeah, and kind of no comment, right? And then you mentioned the same thing happened with Fallon Fox fighting in the UFC, where Fallon's counterfighter, whoever, went to the hospital, got staples in their head, and then when they answered the question, basically couldn't say it's not fair, just said, I've never been hit that hard in my entire life. And that metaphor drags out to every single category, from college sex hookup culture to feminists and media to the workplace. Where should we start? Where's the area that is most obvious, but people don't want to draw attention to it?
Well, I mean, the most obvious differences between men and women are the reproductive differences. And what's been amazing is to see the way even that people are trying to blur. So after I wrote the book, I was at a baby's baptism, and there was a woman there who's a doula, which is somebody who, if you're wanting a more holistic natural birth, they provide support. They're kind of like a midwife. And I was telling her about my book topic, and she said, "Oh yeah, they're now they're telling us we're not allowed to use like sexual pronouns and talk about birth as like something that women do." And I thought, this is absolutely incredible. Like, here, these are women whose whole profession is devoted to the idea of helping women get through something that only women deal with. And it's now, and I document in the book different ways that, you have the British Medical Society. That's their equivalent of the American Medical Association. The British Medical Society coming out and telling employers they shouldn't use the word pregnant woman. You've got the Midwives Alliance of North America using the phrase birthing individual. So I'm saying, if we can't even talk about the basic reproductive differences between men and women, we can't talk about anything. And again, I mean, it just plays into my thesis that women are the ones who are going to be harmed by a culture that can't even appreciate the very difficult and distinct thing that only women go through. So I think starting by understanding that, but beyond just accepting that, yes, accepting science that women are the ones who bear children, men are not, but thinking about how can we structure society in a way that supports that reality for women. And so I talk about, actually, maybe I don't talk about this, but Ivanka Trump has been a big champion of paid maternity leave. And when she came out with a plan with her father, she got a lot of heat because her plan specifically was targeted at women, not men. And I mean, plenty of us can agree that paternity leave is a good thing, but she's like, we don't offer anything. Let's start by helping women, low-income women, the kind of women that have to go back to work, weeks after having a baby, making $12 an hour. And she got heat because there was nothing in there for men. And I appreciate the fact that she was like, no, I'm focusing on the women because women do something that men don't do. I mean, yes, it's great to have men have time off to help their wives, but let's be honest, what they've gone through physically is completely different. And I also talk about a study that was done that found that when you offer men and women the same amount of time off in terms of maternity, paternity leave, it actually ends up helping men in their careers more than women. It backfires on women because all you're really doing is sort of like re-leveling the playing field, just offering people more money. But it gives men an advantage because they're getting more money, more time off when they've done less than half the work.
So anecdotally, how do you feel about paternity? Because I know you have 2 kids. I have 4 kids, and I've said it's the biggest curse on manhood because then I am forced to stay home. I'm totally useless. I offer nothing. Like in this equation, I bring no value whatsoever. I call up the mother-in-law, get her over there, I go back to work. That's like where I can do the most good for the family.
Yeah.
Thoughts on this?
Well,
I hear paternity, I go, no, don't make us do this, please.
I know
it's bad for society.
No, but I mean, that's another thing. Talk about science. There's a whole mound of data that shows how children need their mothers and their fathers and the different roles that they bring. They talk about even that, men sort of roughhouse with their children. And I see this all the time. Like my husband comes home from work, he's throwing the kids on the bed. And I'm like, you're going to break you're going to fall off the bed. You're going to hurt yourself. That women, I mean, people don't like this because it's become politically incorrect to point this out, but it's true. Women are more of the nurturers. We worry about things, but those are the things that keep our children safe. It's sort of these instinctual qualities that we have, but that children also benefit from the different ways their fathers interplay with them. But I mean, even beyond that, the data is infinitely clear that children who grow up without their fathers, even if they have the most loving, devoted mother, they are dramatically more prone to things like teen pregnancy, alcohol, suicide. So, I mean, it's just one of countless examples of the way that science and sociology are showing us how different men and women are, the different roles that we play. And I'm not saying like, oh, we need to go back to the 1950s where women are home in, a skirt with a martini and, men are the only breadwinners. I think we can sort of apply these realities and these principles to the modern era where families have all different sorts of compositions. You might have the dad he's got the flexible job and he's home more with the kids, but there's still something very different that men and women have to offer to each other and to our kids.
Yeah, you're right. I know that in the writings, it says here that you're a big advocate for religious freedom, specifically couched in Catholicism. And so I think what you just said, it has a lot to do with freedom detached from morality, right? We become in a society where we can really do anything we want. But when we start denying morally objective truths about what men and women bring to the table, it doesn't serve us well. It actually backfires, like you said earlier. And I would add to your comment about single motherhood, poverty, juvenile delinquency, life of crime, dropping out of high school. It's pretty much the surest way to lose life's lottery. And this is from someone whose mom was single when I was young. We don't talk about that enough. We blame it on circumstantial and external factors, which is very aggravating to me. I think it'd be a lot easier if we just said, this is the surest route to a unhappy life, statistically. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
I remember when that statistic came out that this was a couple years ago, that 4 in 10 households are now run by single women, and you had the feminists celebrating it. And I actually thought it sort of fit my thesis that the only reason we were celebrating it, or that, much of our culture was celebrating it, was because it was this idea that somehow women were doing what men used to do. They were sort of supplanting the previously male role, which was to be the sole provider for their children. But as you point out, it was sort of twisted because they were celebrating it, while at the same time, everybody, I mean, you could look in the pages of the New York Times to see the data that you were just talking about, that it is basically a guarantee that those children will end up in poverty. I think something like if you're a child born to married parents, you have less than a 6% chance of falling into poverty. If your father is not part of the equation, it's like you have something like a more than 80% chance of falling into poverty. So, why that is sort of a different sociological question, but I think it gets to the stability of the home, but again, that there's clearly something unique about the male and female relationship, that we complement each other, and that's an essential part of sort of the fabric of society.
Yeah, when people say the men and women are equal, I'm like, they're not even similar, not even close. I mean,
well, and one other thing I'd point out, I remember Pope Francis, he said that gender ideology, he said it's a war on the family. And getting back to the single motherhood thing, he got a lot of heat for that, but it really makes sense, because if we're not different and we don't bring different things to the table, then seriously, why bother getting married? And I think we're seeing that happen, that even people who are in long-term relationships are increasingly not getting married. The number of births to cohabitating couples is on the rise, but it begs the sort of question of, what's the point of marriage if it's not to bring men and women together for the sake of their children? But if we're just sort of carbon copies of each other with different looking bodies, then what's the point of marriage, and really what is a family?
Yeah, I sometimes make the joke, hello to my atheist listeners, that atheism, postmodernism is the ultimate in short-term thinking, right? We're not that different. It doesn't matter what we do. Well, if you don't need to get married, then you also don't need to let children survive if you didn't plan on having them. You don't need to think about the next generation outside of political policy. And it's had some pretty drastic and unfortunate results over the last 30 years. And I want to get into some specific examples here. In chapter 1, you talk about the kids not being all right, and you mentioned Title IX. You told the story about Billie Jean King and Robert Briggs, him being beaten tennis, which I think someone should talk to Serena Williams about, since she wants to be the number one tennis player in the world, not the female tennis player. And you talked about the story of Abby Bechtel, she's a feminist, sexual libertine, and conversational terrorist, she self-described, that brought up this whole issue of Target having play sets and girls' play sets. And you go on to talk about how Title IX has been undermining men's sports for a long time, and now it's actually backfiring because it's allowing men to compete as women. Kind of break that down for us and why that matters.
Sure. Well, so Title IX was legislation that dealt with much more than sports. It dealt with basically discrimination on the basis of sex, very important. And we're still fighting over Title IX. The Obama administration tried to swap out sex for gender, which really sort of flips the table on everything. But one of the Title IX is controversial, but because there are certain aspects of it that even, feminists like Phyllis Schlafly have been saying have not helped women. But one thing that most people agree on is that Title IX was a boon for women's sports, and that it carved out a space, acknowledging that women can't play on the men's football team, but want to play sports, basically required that schools and institutions that get any sort of federal funding have to show that they're making an equal effort to fund and cultivate women's sports and men's sports. And that if there is not an opportunity for the woman to play, maybe not football, although I think it has been used for football, but let's say lacrosse, then they can actually play with the boys. That's one of the more controversial aspects, but it was never, ever understood in the reverse, that, if there was no opportunity for the man, that he could then play with the girls, because everybody sort of understood that, biologically it's not really safe for a man to be playing on a woman's team. Well, what's crazy is that now you're seeing, forget about people self-identifying as the opposite sex. I mean, that's a whole nother issue, where you have biological men who self-identify as women competing against women in their own sports and beating them every time, of course, because physically they are just going to be stronger, faster, denser. But you actually have biological males who self-identify as males playing or competing with the girls. So I give this example of a swim meet in Massachusetts where This guy, I think probably because they didn't offer swimming at his school during the winter season, competes with the girls, beats them at every event, breaks their records. But the best part was he broke some of these swimming records with a time that wouldn't have even qualified him for the same event with the men. And these athletic institutions have their hands tied because their increasing understanding of the law is that when you say discriminate on the basis of sex, it means you literally cannot look at or take into account the sex of the athlete. And that, I mean, lawyers are saying will truly devastate female athletics because the whole sort of boon of female athletics came out of the understanding that the sexes are different and women need their own space to have sports. And then that's been really good for girls. It gives them a place to cultivate leadership skills. It gives them sort of a safe space to, just engage recreationally with one another. And then really importantly, it's given them financial opportunities to get into schools and go on to become successful athletes that, are happening at a rate we never would have seen decades ago. So,
yeah, I think you closed up that section by saying that in 2013, the PIAA, Pennsylvania Institute of Athletic, whatever, found that approximately 30% of schools reported having boys on a girls' sports team.
That was one.
So it was one of the most shocking. Ago, but that to me is crazy. If I had been in school and the 30% number was there, we'd have lost our minds. But that's also when being gay was kind of taboo. I mean, that was 15 years ago. It wasn't that long.
Right. That was one of the most shocking things I found in my research. I had to kind of triple check some of this stuff because I was like, this can't be right. But it's right there in the legal brief. So, where that will lead is unclear. But then to my point that girls are always going to lose, there was recently this wrestling case a few months ago where this was actually a female who self-identified as a male who was given an exception to take enhancing performance drugs, basically testosterone.
Super.
And of course, this girl beat her opponent. And everybody was sort of upset because, she was allowed to take these drugs that nobody else is allowed to take. But it's another example of, even in that case, the girls still lose because, the girls can't compete against other girls and win when, you have one of them who's given an exception to take performance-enhancing drugs. So my point is that women's athletics is always going to lose out if we don't accept the reality and don't interpret Title IX as intended to safeguard women's sports. You're just going to, I quote in the book, lawyers actually asking the question, why have the sports segregated by sex? If we're just going to say you can't make any distinctions on the basis of sex, and that's what's so ironic is that's going to take us back to where we were in the 20s, 30s, 40s when you have women, competing against men and being like, wait a minute, this isn't fair.
Yeah, it is interesting. As I read through the book, there's the first iteration of feminism 1.0, then second and third wave. And you quoted Betty Friedan for the National Women's Organization saying that blurring the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, blurring the lines between the genders will be detrimental towards women. Well, first wave feminists, like who's Milo Yiannopoulos' friend, I forget her name, who gets criticized by third wave and says, we've lost our minds here. And it's funny how you take the seed of an idea that denies moral objectivity, and as it germinates, they get further and further away from the root cause. And I think this is really the problem that we're seeing with feminism is they've gone completely off the rails. And in terms of, like in chapter 3, passed out girls in shopping carts, you go into the effects of co-ed dorming at colleges, and I just turn in the pages going, wow, this is really sad. You've got depression, you've got pregnancy, you've got hookups, you've got rape accusations, and you think they could have really just avoided all this if they had said, look, we know some things for sure. Men and women, very different, probably shouldn't be rooming together. If they do, here's the problems we can expect to have. But they don't do that. They do it in reverse and they extol the virtues of blurring the lines and then afterwards make excuses for the bad things that result from it. Give us some examples of some things that are happening on college dormitories that would make people's heads spin.
Well, I truly think that if you want to see where our culture is going on any issue, colleges and universities are about 10 to 20 years ahead of us. And so for the last like 10 to 15 years, all we've been hearing about is a campus rape crisis. And these stories out of Yale that are really, the Yale example is the best one, but it's like not appropriate for me to even be saying the things that these men were shouting at women. But I mean, a good one is, what did they say? Yes, no means yes. I mean, that's like the most sort of mild one that I can say. But no, I mean, what's stunning, this was another thing that I had to go back and triple check, because I was like, how can these statistics be in front of these school administrations and they're not doing anything about it? The most likely place a woman will be raped is in on-campus housing. So you think of like frat parties, which sometimes are on campus, but I mean like school-sponsored dorms. You think of frats as the place where women are being raped. I think it's something like 4% of rapes happen in fraternities, and more than 80% of any sort of sexual assault happens in the dorms. And it just sort of makes sense, much like you're hearing these stories of Harvey Weinstein and Matt Lauer having women come to their hotel rooms for meetings or to bring them a pillow. You've got men and women under the same roof, sleeping in beds, sometimes, next to each other, separated by a thin wall. And then you add in copious amounts of alcohol, and you just can't act surprised when this leads to a torrent of sexual assault. So I think if you want, it's sort of, colleges are like a petri dish, and we've seen, like on a magnified scale, what's happening at these schools. I give the example of Harvard, where they tried to basically ban, and I think they just finally went through and finished doing this, any sort of single-sex social clubs. And the women, they were not expecting that the women were the ones who basically marched through campus protesting, saying, you're taking away our safe spaces, because so many of these women have been assaulted, and they want spaces that are single-sex. I lived in a girls-only dorm when I was at Tufts, and even then, I mean, they had technically strict rules about guys, but there were still women who had guys sleep over, and I just remember even then feeling very uncomfortable when there's like a man in my shower. And so I think colleges are a very good example of what we get ourselves into when we deny sexual reality and just deny reality. And, plenty of people will say, oh, well, these men need to learn to better their behavior. And yes, that's true. But the way you start to teach men to respect women is, for starters, by teaching them to respect women's privacy and their dignity, which to me means a place to bathe and sleep and shower where they can be safe and private.
I want to segue from that into the Navy and the submarines, because that one blew my mind. But as you were talking about that, I was thinking one of my main questions I had was this idea of gender theory. And you go into the book and say that gender theory didn't exist. I think you ran a Lexis search from 1900 to 2008 about how many times it was being used. And it started to shoot up in the 60s. And then it skyrocketed in the 80s. And you made the comment that 50 years later, we don't really know what gender theory is. We're still experimenting. And I was on Steven Crowder's channel the other day where he had a girl try to convince him that there are more than two genders. And you're sitting there listening going, this person's brain is mashed potatoes. Like, they've been totally hoodwinked into deluding themselves. And you could tell by her appearance, sadly, but the outside matched the inside. And so when you were talking about this, I was thinking about Kesha and her rape case. And I think the big issue with the campus rape culture, it mirrors Hollywood in that they're all talking about how awful the problem is, but the problem is really awful where they are, like where these people exist. And that's on the college dorm. So you made the example of Kesha, who basically sued her old agent or her producer and said that she'd been abused, not just emotionally, but sexually, verbally, physically for over 10 years, and then claimed that he drugged her. And when she woke up, she was sore and sick and had no memory of what happened. The judge, who was female, warn women, actually threw out the case on the basis that his actions weren't directed. I might be misquoting this, but you said that his motivation wasn't actually rape because he showed no animus towards women as a whole. And you make the claim that if you blur the line, that rape actually doesn't exist. It can't be a thing. And this case was proof of that. So kind of expound on that a little bit and tell us, have there been any other examples, or did I not explain it very well? Like, what are we going to look at down the road if rape actually isn't a thing? If gender's not a thing, is rape a thing?
Right. Well, this is a point that I make and a question that I ask. It's a real question. If sex difference isn't real, then why is rape not any different from just aggravated physical assault? The reason we accept rape as a particularly heinous crime is that it is a sex-based offense. Yes, you have, rapes of men on men. Women cannot rape each other, really. I suppose they can sexually harass each other, but the reason that it's in its own sort of distinct category is that it's sex-based. You have one sex using their sexual advantage to take advantage of the other sex. And this was something that came out in all the debates about the bathroom issue, which is, you have women who've been sexually assaulted saying they're not comfortable. They feel unsafe, in such an intimate setting with the sex that assaulted them. I give an example of a domestic violence center in Canada and this example was given to me by an extremely left-wing feminist that had to sue all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court for the right to keep men out of a rape crisis center, biological men. And so what this points at is this deeper issue of our laws that protect women are based on this idea of sex, including our own Constitution, that sexual difference is an immutable category, much like race, which is why you cannot discriminate on the basis of it. And so when we start blurring the lines or replacing sex with gender, which has no meaning, as Facebook showed us when they tried to offer 70 different genders and it was not enough, then suddenly what you're actually doing is pulling out the rug from women in terms of their legal rights to make claims on the basis of their sex. So how are women going to say, and you see this, for example, already in cases where women are saying, I feel uncomfortable, with the bathroom or the locker room example, women who are saying, I feel uncomfortable with the biological male in my, private space, were told that they were the ones discriminating on the basis of gender. So it's crazy. Suddenly it's like flipped back on them. But my point is that even beyond the rape issue, how are women going to make claims on the basis of their sex if we don't accept sex as a legal category to begin with? And there is a movement, a very distinct movement, to replace sex with gender. Gender doesn't mean anything, and I think that threatens women's legal rights. And this is an interesting area where you're actually seeing really left-wing feminists line up with social conservatives in agreement, kind of for different reasons, but in agreement that movement threatens the identity and the rights of women as a distinct class. And are women a distinct class if there's more than two genders? Or do we get diluted down into, one of countless, infinite genders, if you will? So that to me is the biggest flaw and most serious risk in gender ideology, that it's not a harmless thing, and it does threaten women's rights.
Yeah. If I can just decide to be a woman, then guess what? Your woman femininity has no value whatsoever. I'm really sorry. I've had a really hard time focusing because all I can think about is the men at the rape crisis center. So they open the doors and these women come in after being raped, and there's just a bunch of men saying, hey, baby, come on, let's hug it out. Let me give you some of that toxic masculinity. I'll make it feel all better. That story blew my mind a little bit. The one that really got me, I was talking to a friend in the Navy the other day. I go, have you heard this thing about the submarines? And I'm going to forget the details because you have so much data in the book. But basically, that there's this big push to put women on the front lines and have them be the tip of the spear, which totally makes sense. I think that, you got to send the pawns, again, facetious, you got to send the pawns in first, let them take the bullets, and then strategically reevaluate your options. So sure, women in the front lines. We've had thousands of years of barbarians throughout history. None of them sent the women into war first that I'm aware of, but I need to do some more reading on that. But the submarine example, where basically you had these women who were the trailblazers, the pioneers of sexual experimentation on submarines in the Navy. And we found out later that every single time that one of these women used the bathroom, used the shower, or took their clothes off, they were being monitored / recorded, and these recordings are being passed around. And basically, to me, again, going back to Hollywood, it's like any new Netflix show that comes out. If you see a woman, you pretty much have a good odds of seeing her naked throughout the show. #feminism. And then the Navy later comes and does a special report, council, etc., and basically denies that there's any issues with this program at all. Did I miss any important facts there? Like how outrageous is this to read? And how bad do you feel for these women?
No, and beyond that, this has been reversed a little bit with this administration, but they were pushing even harder to integrate every last thing, boot camp, So yeah, they experiment with submarines where you're in a tiny tube. You don't have separate bathrooms because there isn't space for separate bathrooms or separate sleeping spaces. And what happens? The women are systematically filmed naked. And their response is, well, let's find every last vestige of single-sex space in the military and integrate it. So that's sort of, I mean, there's sort of two separate issues here. You have that, and then you have the, pushing women into combat roles when, the Marines, I think it was the Marines, spent something like $10 million on a study to just genuinely see what happens when we do mixed-sex combat units. And the
Marines
results
were the ones that came out very honest, right? Didn't you give the Marines credit for actually doing an honest survey?
And they resisted the integration, and they were forced to do it anyways. And, I need to check back and see what's happened with that. There were so many of the issues in my book have been kind of changing as we go. For example, the effort to change the selective service to require women to register for the draft. Everybody's like, oh, we're never going to have a draft again. And it's like, well, then why is it such a big deal that we make women register for the draft? And by the way, I mean, I think it's a little delusional to think we're never going to have any sort of military crisis again. And people point to Israel, but we're not Israel. We're a much bigger country, and the roles that women are doing in the Israeli army are not per se running to the front lines. They're doing I try to make the point in my book that it's not that I'm saying women shouldn't do these things, or, be in the military, this, that, or the other thing, but that instead of saying, oh, women can only be equal with men in the military if they are allowed to do the most alpha male, combat role, which most men in the military aren't even physically qualified for, can we find a way to change the sort of promotion structure such that women can still succeed and flourish, and we can take advantage of their very sort of the different things that they bring to the table. I've heard people talk about how, like in Afghanistan, having women go into these villages and do the sort of front work there helps put these people at ease, and they're able to do like incredible reconnaissance work, because when you have a man come into a person's home, that has a totally different dynamic than when a female soldier goes in. And I talk about some of that with policing. I tried to keep an open mind when I was doing my research, and I was struck by how with police work, because it's different than, physical fighting. I mean, sure, there's a physical aspect to it, but a lot of it is actually sort of like talking with people and, sort of diplomacy skills that sometimes women make better police officers than men. And
I think you said de-escalation, right? They actually are,
right.
They're naturally good at that.
I mean, you can't de-escalate a fire, but, when you've got a gun and you've got a bad guy, the gun is sort of the equalizer. It gives her an upper hand, and then it gives her a chance to use her sort of feminine skills to de-escalate some of these situations. So, that's sort of the point I try to make in the book is, can we look at these things and find a way to bring what women bring to the table, to use that without putting them in harm, putting them at a greater risk, without putting others at a greater risk. And I think that starts with understanding what makes us different, especially sort of the physical realities.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the fire department. This will be one of my last questions, because my father-in-law was a firefighter, and he said things that he couldn't say politically. They weren't very politically correct during this experimentation G.I. Jane phase, and you wrote about him in detail. And to give you credit, you did say in the police force it's been a huge success because of the specialized roles of women. In the fire department, not so much. You talked about the LA experiment where basically candidates weren't passing. Then you talked about when they finally did pass them, it was because they lowered the standards. And I'm, again, paraphrasing. Then you talked about the amount of workman's comp and accommodations and disability and additional job tasks where men had to double up so that women didn't feel like they were isolated. Help me understand what a disaster the firefighter implementation was for women and how we can fix it. Because I don't take pleasure in pointing this out. It's just unfortunate that we can't talk about it because automatically it's sexist. It's not objective reality. It's these things aren't polite.
Well, firefighting is kind of like the combat of the emergency response. It is, of all the different emergency response roles out there, it is the most physically arduous. Even if you're not actually fighting a fire, just, you show up and you got all the gear and the hoses and the ladders. And what happened was, women were getting hurt at dramatically high rates just going through the training. They weren't passing. And then what they started to do, and again, I had to kind of triple check all these stories, was they just started graduating women even though they didn't pass the physical test. So it'd be like sending women into combat even though, they don't pass any of the physical standards whatsoever, which, that's its own separate conversation, which is we do have two sets of physical standards often in police forces, firefighting, our military, which is sort of this ironic acknowledgement of the fact that women and men are physically different. But no, I think it's a very good example of what happens when we try to say, oh, we're promoting equality by pushing women into these roles that they're essentially. I'm not saying they're doomed to fail it. I think there have been some examples of women who've been able to get through firefighting training, but it's not that women aren't equal with men if they aren't able to perform the duties of a fireman.
Yeah, it's just that this whole Barstool Sports idea that women should do the exact same jobs. I don't know if I follow Barstool on Facebook, and they show pictures of beautiful women, and they show pictures of women that we think, how do I say this nicely, to arouse some of the faculties of the men. And it's usually them chugging, doing keg turns, or sticking a giant wad of chew in their mouth. And I'm thinking, gross. My guy friends do this. I don't want my girlfriend doing this, but I can't say that out loud. So yeah, there are some Briennes of Tarth, and I get that. But overall, it's become a problem. So I want to close with the question I ask anyone who's written a good book like yourself. You identify a lot of the problems, you throw in all the statistics, you back up your assertions. What do we do about it? And I'll offer mine first, and then I'll have you answer. I think when I'm reading the book, I think back to, and you being a Catholic advocate, to the examples in the scriptures and what they valued and what was important. And one of the ones that came out for me was when Rachel was not able to have any kids in the Old Testament. There's a verse where it talks about she was solemn near unto death. And she actually said out loud she'd rather be dead. And it was because of the importance they put on their legacy. And the fact that women have the unique ability, or as Gavin McGinnis says, they're superheroes. They're literal superheroes because they can create the next generation of humans. And that was their focus, and knowing that they had the power to shape the world. Now we've traded that for arguing about girls' play sets and making sure that we can carve out our own place in the workforce. I don't believe that we should sacrifice one for the other. I think we should appreciate the inherent value of both. How do we solve the problems that you articulate in the book? What's your solution?
I think there's two, because it is very overwhelming. I think there's two concrete ways that people can push back. One is in their own families, and to live this out and model it to your children if you have children. Because, we have this incredible opportunity with our kids to sort of shape them for the future. And the second way is to actually pay attention to what's going on in your community and push back. I talk about how when these schools try to change the curriculum and the parents show up, I give success stories of examples where they managed to stop or at least maintain the right to take their kids out of some of these programs. But I think you have this sliver of elites who are pushing this stuff, like in the school curriculum. And when the parents come and show up in mass and push back, it has a real effect. So don't think that you're powerless in the face of these things. But, find one small way in your community that you can sort of step up for, for this idea that we're different, and that maintaining those differences is actually the best way to ensure that men and women, boys and girls, can flourish.
Ashley McGuire, the author of Sex Scandal. You can read her work all over the internet, but I am curious, Ashley, two questions. One, what's the next step? Are you writing another book? And two, where should they go to find you? Is it your website, or do you have a certain publication where you syndicate regularly?
That's a good question. I don't have a website. You can find me. I actually publish a lot of my work through this group that I work with, the Catholic Association. But you can also follow me on Facebook. And I don't know what the next step is. I guess keep writing about all this, and I don't know. I haven't thought about another.
If you're taking a break, that's fine. Just enjoy the break. But I really enjoyed it. I hope that we'll see more work from you in the future, and I certainly do appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.